Well, welcome to Qdabra's weekly webinar. This is first part in a multi-part series when we're talking about InfoPath surveys. Good morning. This webinar, we've got a bunch of goals here. We are trying to provide relevant tidbits, trinkets, nuggets for your SharePoint lifestyle here to help you get through the maze and find the reward, which is working business process on SharePoint. So we're going to do about 20 minutes here for the presentation and demos, and then we'll have time for questions. We are going to be showing you real life stuff here. Sometimes it doesn't work as smoothly as we want. Appreciate your patience. And if you want any of the stuff that you see today, please go ahead and send us your contact information. There will be a slide at the end of the presentation with that information. So today's agenda, surveys, part one. Now, we're going to be talking about lots of different techniques, and I want to just go over the best practices here. When we're building surveys with InfoPath, and I'm going to show you a couple survey forms, but you want to have a data-driven design because you don't want to reinvent the wheel over and over again. Now, what that means is that when you create an InfoPath form template, you're actually creating an XSN file, right? Switch to my folder here. You can see here I've got a survey form. That's an XSN file, right? That's the format that InfoPath saves the form template in. When you publish it to SharePoint, it's also an XSN file. Now, when you save it out there as an XSN, you want to have one XSN for all of your surveys. In other words, think about your surveys. You've got a survey every 2 or 3 weeks that you do, maybe a survey a month. Maybe you're doing surveys every week. And rather than have one XSN for every survey, right? In other words, one XSN per survey. So if you do 100 surveys a year, or let's say you do 20 surveys a year, you would end up with 20 different XSNs. Rather than do that, we want to create one XSN, one form that you can use over and over again. And the way you do this is you use configuration data. So your form is going to pull in questions from a separate form, and I'll show you this in a second. So this is the first best practice when you're developing surveys. The other thing that you have to do when you're doing a data-driven design, and data-driven design is good because it saves you time rather than have to reinvent the wheel over and over again. You just do it once rather than have to create separate reports for every single survey. You just do it once, and you can even with a consistent XSN, with one XSN for all your surveys, you can even do things like you can do metrics across questions. So you can have efficacy measures. How efficacious is this? What's the efficacy? I can't even say that word. How good is this question, right? Is it being answered a lot? Is this question a problem? And you can look at these things historically over the course of many surveys. You can do this kind of regression analysis because your data set, your data source is consistent across all those surveys. So the way you do it is you create two forms. You create a config form and a filler form. And that's what I'm going to show you today. And then you need to make sure you copy those questions from the config form into the main data source. And I'll show you that as well. Second technique that we're going to go through today is question IDs. When you're creating a survey form with multiple surveys, potentially, you want to make sure that those questions have unique IDs. And that's going to enable a scalable solution for you. You'll be able to do hierarchical questions, question, sub-question. You'll see that today. You'll be able to do a conditioned question. If the answer for the first question is true, we'll show question 2, and so on. And the way you do all that is you create these IDs, identifiers, right, for the questions. So I'll show you this today. And especially when you're reporting across surveys, you need to make sure that your question IDs are unique. How do you do it? Well, the simplest way to do it is to just use the date and the time stamp, plus the order of the question in that list. And we can also then see how we put together the question using substring functions. Now, the InfoPath form, InfoPath itself has a wonderfully expressive macro language, which is called XPath. And that XPath language is kind of like macros in Excel. You can use it to take apart a date timestamp and put it together in a format that looks like a unique ID. Third best practice for today is scale out. So when you're building a survey, you need to be thinking about the big picture and where you're going with it. If you have just one person who's sending the surveys, you're just going to have a config file. But sooner or later, you might have multiple senders. You might have 5 people in your organization that are sending the surveys out. And they can't all open the same config file at the same time, right? They want to edit it themselves. They want to add their questions. So you really need to move it to SharePoint. We'll talk about this more in a week or two when we talk about SharePoint surveys, because we're going to be talking about surveys now for several weeks. And when you're dealing with multiple senders, you want to map your config data to SharePoint list. The first step is still the config file. So it doesn't mean you're going to jump to SharePoint list. It always behooves us to start with the config file, because that forces us down the path of creating a good data source. Once we have that data source created, we can always move the config file to a SharePoint list and eventually to a SQL database. When you do end up with hundreds of responses, well, that's not too many, hundreds of responses work fine in an email folder, which you'll see today. They also work fine in the SharePoint list. When you get thousands or tens of thousands of responses to the surveys, then what you're going to want to do is move to a browser-based form in SharePoint. Maybe you have an extranet site that you're going to post it on, and you'll be submitting to a database via a web service. So those are just some ideas. Three best practices here. The first one, again, make sure that you choose a data-driven design to save you time. Second, make sure your questions are uniquely identifiable so that you can actually look at them after the fact, use them for conditioning. And third is when you're scaling out your surveys, you need to think about what how many people you're going to have. Okay, so here are the survey patterns that we're going to go through. So number one is going to be email, and that's what I'm going to demo today. I'll demo the email yes/no form with hierarchy. There's some cool techniques here. We're going to talk about those. Next week, I'll do a more complex version of the survey in email. And the first one today, what you'll see is let me just show you here. So today we have the survey form. And here's my survey form. Now, this survey form is something that you will fill out in email. Now, what's the benefit of that? The benefit of email is that you don't need to worry about connectivity, because they can cache the email offline. You don't need to worry about the person being in your domain, because they might be completely outside of your organization. That's fine. But they do need the filler, and they do need Outlook. And the form needs to be set to secure restricted permissions, okay? And then you'll need to, whenever you update the questions, you just need to update the XSN. So it's a little bit of a manual config when the question set changes, which isn't bad, really. It's really easy, and I'll show you that today. And so that's the first one we're looking at. And this survey here is kind of nice. It's a really simple survey, and we'll just fill it out here. And you can see I've done this before. The survey is called InfoPath Form Development Common Questions. So when we engage a new customer, we want to go through these questions. Do you need an email form? If they answer yes, we're going to fill out this form. And you can see here, this form actually has a cost column. This is an optional thing you may not want to include. This is just one example of the survey form, but this is one to show you today. And as I kind of change these, you can see that I've got sub-questions and then sub-questions underneath the questions. So I've got 3 levels of questions here. And as I total these up, you can see that the total amount is also changing down below. Similarly, if the form is full trust, and then we would have other questions down here. Okay, so you can get the idea here. So this is a question. I'm done with it. I'm going to submit it. It's going to send it to me, and we're done. Okay, so that's the simple survey. Now, let's say, for example, that I want to change the questions in that survey. So I have a config form here, question editor. Now, the config form, and I'm going to show you the techniques we're using. I'm just going to go through and demo them real quick, though. The config form allows me to enter data for any survey. So I can create a new survey. I can also preview it with an existing question set. So let's do that. Form options, preview. Underneath the preview tab, you have the ability to preview using a file. And we're going to use that question set that we looked at in the other form. So here you see that I have the all the questions. You can see I've got multiple levels, and I've got the name of the survey. So I can go up here and change V2. I just call it V2, and I can come in here and I can add a question. You can say the question is going to be, will you store it? Will HTML files be stored on SharePoint? Okay, and then what we can do is we can add a question to this, a sub-question that says, what version we have, SharePoint version 2007. And do you have, actually, I don't want to do that. I want to add another question after this here. Let me just go back here a step so I can make sure I do this correctly. The UI still needs a little bit of work. So we've added 2 questions to the form. Now what we're going to do is we're going to save, and we just add a simple cost here. I don't know if I really care about the cost so much. Right now the cost is 0 for all of these. I need to update those. But I'm just going to add these for now. And I'm going to save this out. And I'm going to save this out as the question editor samples. Actually, let me call this a different name here. Let me call this question editor sample 2. Okay, so now I go back to my survey form, and all I have to do before I publish it is I say data connections, and I change the question data connection to pull from that new file. And I want to make sure that the name of it is the same, and if it is, then I won't have to fix up any of the data connections, any of the view connections. Okay, now I can preview it. And you can see that I've got that 3rd question in there. Okay, so that's the really simple way of updating the survey. Now, once I have the survey ready and I want to send it out, what I want to do next is send it to myself. So I want to save this out, and I just go to Outlook, and I'm going to start a new email here. Just attach the XSN to the email. Now, why am I doing this? Well, because if I don't do this, InfoPath will not cache the form, and I won't be able to create an Outlook folder for it. So I just sent the form to myself, and what I'm going to do is show you that real quick. Okay, so I just sent it to myself. I'm going to open it from the email. Now you see that little dialog that popped up. Maybe it was too fast, but there was a little moment there where it was caching the form. Okay, now I've got the form cached. Now what can I do? Now what I can do is I can go into Outlook, and I've got a survey folder here. This is from a previous survey I did for part of class. What I'm going to do is and you can see here in Outlook, I've got this nice little InfoPath folder here. Check that out. Now I can go in here and I can change the properties for this. Specifically, I can specify that I want to use that new survey form. Now that's going to, of course, not work with the old data because the old data has different promoter properties, so we'll just delete that. But now what I can do is I can fill out the form, and let's just do that real quick. I'm going to go back to my inbox here, and I'm going to double-click the form, fill it out, and submit it. Okay, submitting it, and I have a rule that is set on my inbox. This is just an Outlook rule, standard Outlook rule. And I'm going to be, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be moving those new forms, those feedback forms, into my survey feedback folder. And give me 1 second here while I do that. While I'm doing this, I mean, obviously we have a chat here in the link session, so you can actually chat questions in. So, okay, so here's my new folder now. I've had 2 surveys, the first one I filled out and the second one. Notice that the first one I filled out, I didn't actually specify anything, I guess. But now I've got this promoted property in here, and it's correctly got the survey name, that's good. Total cost was somehow not promoted, so I'm not sure why that happened. But here's my form, and it just opens up in InfoPath in Outlook. So Outlook has this nice feature, 2010, that allows you to create an InfoPath folder, and then you can basically collect all of your surveys coming in from the field into this folder. And you can even double-click, you can even export this data to Excel using a form action here, and you can export it to Excel. Let's try that one more time. Form actions, export to Excel, and it's going to create an Excel spreadsheet that has the data in it. Now, what I want to do is quickly show you a couple of techniques that we're using for this form, a couple of techniques that you can use, and you can see that all the data is included there, total cost and so forth. And this is my Excel spreadsheet that got generated when I selected that option. Let's take a look at the form real quick. There's a couple of techniques that are pretty cool in here. One of them is, you saw in the editor form, what we're doing is we're doing this, what we call indent. How are we doing the indent, right? You guys want to do this, right? Indent's cool. So the way we do it is kind of tricky. We have like this, I don't know if you can see this, but right here next to the number, we're automatically numbering the questions. We have a calculated value right here. If you can see that little dashed border here. If I click on that, and if I look at the properties for the calculated value, we'll see what we're doing. And it's kind of tricky. What we're doing specifically is we're just actually, we've got a long string here, underlined string, and we're just saying that we want to take, 5 characters for level 1, 10 characters for level 2. The level is the level of the question. So every time we click on this button here, we're actually creating a child question. We've got a rule in here that sets, inserts the child and sets the parent. And when it does that, there's got to be a rule in here that sets the level of the question. So we're only supporting up to 4 levels right now, but you could do more than that. Let's see here if we can find it. So there's got to be some other rule that sets the level here, because the level is, let me just see if I can find it here. Okay, so here's the level. So every time we insert a row into the table, and this is just a table. If we look at the data source here, you'll see that this is just a stock table. It's just a repeating table, right? It's just got questions. It's got an attribute for level, the parent, whether it's a parent or not, what the parent ID is. The question number, this is the unique thing we'll talk about next week. The question text and the cost. Very simple schema. This form generates an XML file, right? This is our question editor form. Then what we do is we switch to our question form. This is the form that actually gets filled out. And this guy includes that question XML file inside of it, right? And it has the same technique here for indenting. And the schema you can see is a little bit different. The data source on the right, we call this the schema. This is a little bit different, but you can see that there's a sub portion here that's very similar. And what we're doing is we're copying the data from that data connection, that questions secondary data source, into our main data source when the form loads. Take a look at the form load. It's not on that form load. Where is it? It's a default value. So if we look at the question text here, we've got the default value specified. We're just basically selecting from the secondary data source. We're filtering it based on the question number, making sure that it's equivalent. Okay, so that's a quick rundown of the forms techniques. I'm just going to switch back to my presentation real quick. Next week, we're going to talk about complex email forms. So we talked today, we have the yes/no. That's the only type of question we have. Not super exciting, but it is useful in many cases to have a simple form. Unlike, this is an important thing, unlike SurveyMonkey and some of these other online survey tools, you can do rich surveys in InfoPath that are they're very rich, basically. You can do surveys that have conditional visibility. You can do surveys that have a lot of rules and conditions and that capture a lot of different kinds of data. So there's a lot of power here, and of course you don't have to pay anybody. You can just use your InfoPath if you have InfoPath. The key requirement for part one, for this first one, is that they have InfoPath Filler. Now we're going to see next week, we'll continue this. We'll add more data types. So we'll add like drop-downs, rich text, things like that to our survey. So we'll be able to specify what kind of a question it is, what kind of answer we should expect. We might even do some conditional formatting. In other words, if this question is true, please show this other question. Now, and then the following week, we'll talk about how to use email and upload the forms to SharePoint. And we're going to show you how to do it using an email submit. So you just email a SharePoint email address, and then automatically the form gets saved in the library using a simple workflow. There's another approach, and that is to send it to an admin desk. So you've got like a person who's reviewing all these forms before they get uploaded to SharePoint. They just open them up. Yep, this is not spam. And they click commit. They click submit. So there's two ways to do that. And then the following week, part 4, we'll move into SharePoint and we'll show how you do complex surveys in the browser. We'll also use lists for our question set. We'll move the config file into a list as opposed to an XML file. Lots of value there. Obviously, you can have multiple people sending out surveys. You don't need to worry about your config. You don't need to worry about a bunch of other things here. And then we'll move on to more complex scenarios, specifically using the SharePoint lists to do reporting on our survey data. If you have more than 50,000 items, maybe you want to archive them because your SharePoint list is going to get slow, maybe. And so eventually you might want to move to a database. And that's the grand finale from at the end of June. We'll talk about that. So really quick recap here. The email yes/no survey, it has some cool things in it. It has an indentation. We have in here a question. We have a button for the question here. If we preview this, you can see that instead of using the out-of-box widget for the question, we have a button here for the survey. This is the question editor. The question editor uses a button to insert items. That's pretty cool. We have automatic numbering for the questions. So those are some simple techniques that we've done here. Nothing really super fancy, but the indentation is kind of cool. The filler form then has a title that's automatic based on the survey name. It uses the questions from the config file, so it's data-driven. It has sub-questions. Obviously, it only shows them if the parent is true. It calculates a cost, and it allows you to submit an email. And you saw me do that. I set up my Outlook folder. I sent an email to myself with the survey feedback. I was able to go into the folder and see the email, see the full form, and then to export those into Excel. So that's a quick demo and presentation for you today. I'm going to go to the chat window and see if people have questions. If you want to get the goodies, just go to our Contact Us page, fill out this really simple form here, and we will send you the samples. And I know that most people, well, not most people, there were a few people. Most people have audio and they can hear me just fine, but there were a few people that did not get the client installed, and I'm sorry about that. Obviously, they can't hear me say this, so we will apologize to them in email, tell them what to do. Meanwhile, if you've got questions, go ahead and chat them in the chat. And if not, we look forward to having you here next week. Once again, we are presenting these quick weekly webinars to you. And the purpose here is to give you a nugget, give you a little technique that you can use to improve your SharePoint lifestyle. Thank you, Evan, for the feedback. Evan, I hope I'm saying your name correctly. We'll do it again next week, and we'll record all these, put them up on our YouTube site, give you a link for them. And I'm just going to stop the recording now, and we'll just, I'll still be here to answer questions. If you've got a question, I'll be here for 1 or 2 more minutes, so please start typing in the chat window if you have a question. And you can ask me about anything. You can ask me about, you know, what are we going to do in Syria? Well, we're going to take them out. Or, I don't know. I'm just kidding. But, you know, I'm not going to be able to make a comment about that. But I will be able to make a comment about InfoPath. I'd be happy to answer any InfoPath questions you have. And going to be